Oh, yeah.
No.
Yes.
What's tomorrow? Oh, yeah. Yes, please do. We probably should send a message to all fellows and brothers. He's here in this room.
Oh, it's here too. It's not over here.
It's here in the
Oh,
room.
awesome.
Remind them to send it to the email. We encourage them to do all that. They're not looking at the website either. At least you didn't jump about it. Right. Oh, you can, because you have it sitting there. You can. What's Carlos doing? Yes. Are you coming to hear the talk?
I like it when this one that I will.
She's good. Okay. This lady in the red pants is going to swim. You know her?
No, the
Okay. So can I help you? Sir?
no,
I'm about to start.
you don't need anything because I go out. Okay.
Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Brown Bag. My name is Stephen McLeod, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to the Washington Library. Before we get started, I wanted to give you a few updates on some events that we've got coming up. Tomorrow night, we're going to be hosting a book talk here in this room with Dr. Jane Calvert, who's going to discuss her new book, Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson. And that's a free event. You just sign up via the website. This weekend, we have two special events. On the 18th, we're hosting a presidential transition lecture and historic document viewing here in the library with our executive director, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. And then on the 19th, Dr. Chervinsky will be moderating a discussion with historian Matt Costello and C-SPAN founder Susan Swain on the history of inaugurations and the White House. And that's going to be taking place over in the Ford Orientation Center. And you can purchase those tickets via the website. On January the 29th, we're hosting our next lunch at the library, and that's going to be a little bit different topic for us, but all on topic, and it's going to be with comic book artist Renee Witterstatter, and she's going to discuss her comic book, Cloaked Crusader, George Washington and Comics in Pop Culture. And then on February the 13th, we're going to be hosting our next Brown Bag, and that's going to feature research fellow Philip Mills Harrington, and he's going to be presenting on his research topic, the Plantation Revival. You might have seen a lot of these come across the screen up here as I've been speaking. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Whitney Nell Stewart is an associate professor of history and faculty of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas. Beginning next month, she will become the Deputy Executive Director of Collections and Education at the Coastal Georgia Historical Society on St. Simon's Island. She's written and edited several articles, essays, and anthologies, and is the author of the award-winning This Is Our Home: Slavery and the Struggle on Southern Plantations. At the George Washington Presidential Library, Whitney has been researching the relationship here between bound labor and early American wine. So please join me in welcoming Whitney Stewart.
Hey y'all, thanks for being here today. Want to give some thank yous to start. Library staff, especially Stephen, Nell, Ileana, and Sam. Library and Mount Vernon volunteers, including Tom, the airport valet and pound cake maker extraordinaire. Holly, the landscape historian, Allison, vice president of education, Leslie, curator of historic gardens and landscapes, Steve, yeah, the head distiller and director of historic trades, the many archaeologists and tour guides who took time to talk with me. It just so happened when I was here, both in the fall and this time, that there were two culinary historians, Justin and Ramin, who I learned a lot from. And then also my fellows, including SJ, Mathieu, Meg, Sally, Kelly, Sandy, and what I am now calling the DeVos Dream Team of Charlene and James. And then I have to end with, she's not here today, but the incomparable Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library, Dr. Lindsay Travinsky. Thank you all for being here today. So my time at Mount Vernon has been very productive. I changed the title of my book while I was here, so that's pretty productive, I think. I've been actively researching and working on this book for a little over 6 months, but its origins do go back a bit further because they're rooted in the history that came out of my first book. Wait for it.
Thanks to Microsoft, we have, sorry,
No worries.
it has decided that it wants me to reboot the computer right now. And
Oh, great.
I'm trying to
Okay.
tell that, no, we're not doing that.
We're not going to do it. I won't do what you say.
Postpone. Thanks. 3 hours will be fine.
Okay.
Now,
There it is. My first book, This Is Our Home, Slavery and Struggle on Southern Plantations, which was published at the end of 2023. And in my 5th chapter, I focus on this man and this place, James Henry Hammond and his Redcliffe plantation in Beach Island, South Carolina. And it was while reading through the thousands and thousands of pages of James Henry Hammond's papers that I came across a connection between slavery, plantations, and a crop that I didn't quite expect, wine grapes. James Henry Hammond was the nation's most prominent late antebellum pro-slavery zealot. And so I found it kind of befuddling and intriguing that as the country was devolving into civil war, much of Hammond's attention was on growing grapes, making wine, and reaping big profits at his Redcliffe plantation. In the late 1850s, while hundreds of other enslaved laborers tended the cotton and corn across his massive South Carolina estate, a few enslaved men, along with some hired free help, had been busy laying out and trenching acres of vineyards, tending the grape clusters, and as you can see here in a very grainy photo of a James Henry Hammond letter, they were digging and bricking the wine cellar. And I just want to take a quick pause here and bring you to last year when archaeologists found the wine cellar. We didn't know exactly where it was in the landscape, but during the field school last year, while I was there standing over the archaeologists digging, they found the wine cellar. It was absolutely thrilling. And that wine cellar was going to do much more than just store barrels. James Henry Hammond apprenticed his enslaved black son, named Henderson, to a German viticulturist in nearby Augusta. He did so in order to, quote, train him in vine culture and winemaking. With that training, Hammond hoped that the entire process from fruit to fermented beverage could be done in-house and by his laborers at Redcliffe. By 1862, Hammond was sipping his most recent vintage and ecstatically proclaiming that a gallon of this straw-colored wine would yield a whopping $10 a gallon. The Civil War was raging, yet Hammond was intoxicated by the future that wine and slavery offered together. No scheme offers such profits, he argued. Millions are in it. When I read this, it was one of those moments in the archive where there was a light bulb. I knew that enslavers had long and often been searching for the next great slave-made cash crop, but I had never heard that it might have been wine. I wondered, what's the history of Hammond's obsession with grapes and wine, his dreams of its massive profits, and his desire to make it fully in-house with enslaved labor, from fruit to fermented beverage? How does this fit in with the histories that we know, the histories of slavery, the histories of wine, that have to this point appeared disconnected from each other? And it's true that in both fields, wine studies and slavery studies, our current understanding of how each shaped the other ranges from limited to absent. There are rare passing references to slavery and enslaved people in histories of wine, while wine is rarely ever mentioned in the histories of slavery, except maybe to talk about the drinking proclivities of a particular enslaver. This now seems astounding to me, for the sources, especially when we read them with a slavery scholar's eye to what's missing or misrepresented, tell us that wine and unfreedom were long connected in this country. Expertise in the history of slavery and its innovative methods, paired with a growing knowledge of wine, I now hold a level 2 certificate in wine from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. This allows me to look at sources, provide context, and reach new conclusions about this overlooked component of early American history. Now, if it seems so clear to me, why hasn't this history been told yet? I think there are several reasons, a few of which I just want to highlight here. Most importantly, assumptions that we make about the where, who, and when of wine in America. So let's start with the where. The history of American wine overwhelmingly focuses on one state. Anybody got ideas? Yeah, it's California. Every now and then there's maybe like a passing reference to New York or Oregon that might seem important enough to warrant inclusion. The who, white European descended people, most often men, engaging in that artisanal, artistic work, right? The kind of swirling in the cellar that you see happening in the image on the top there, which ignores the farm work that actually comprises much of what wine work is. The when, it's all post-prohibition. The 18th Amendment is seen as such a massive breaking point in the wine industry that everything before it is deemed unimportant, disconnected from the present, so not really worth mentioning. My work thus far has shown me that these assumptions are false, that the American South was integral to the development of an American wine industry, that core to that development was the labor of enslaved and other bound workers, and that wine was a significant agent of change in American history that cannot be understood without going back centuries before Prohibition. I believe there's also another reason this history hasn't been explored, which is an assumption by historians that wine was simply a frivolous elite pleasure rather than a potentially important American-made product. Now, it's true that what most Americans today understand as wine, which is a fermented beverage made of European grape varieties, that this was overwhelmingly drunk by elite and middling Americans until fairly recently. But their quest to make and drink that wine influenced much more than just their own cellars. It shaped the nation. My research has shown that wine was not merely a pleasurable drink, of course it was that. It was regarded by Americans, including many of these founding fathers, as a potential solution for a range of issues that they faced: economic, political, cultural, even moral issues. In addition, we cannot put our contemporary misconception of what makes wine back onto the past. While I'm going to today be focusing on wine made from grapes, we must remember that wine has never been made only with grapes, let alone only with European grapes, nor has it only ever been drunk by wealthy Americans. In fact, it's been made from all kinds of fruits and vegetables and roots, anything that is fermentable at all levels of American society. So what constituted wine and who was drinking it was much more expansive than what we think now, as the work of wine writers like Sidney Love shows us. Now, I hope to show that these assumptions severely limit how we understand the past in my new book, tentatively titled Bitter Vines, Slavery, the South, and the Roots of American Wine. At its most basic, it will uncover the origins of American wine, which I argue are rooted in the history of slavery in the South. This will be the first work to explore the long history from the earliest colonial days to the final years of Reconstruction of how Americans, including George Washington, dreamed and schemed about how to make and profit from wine within systems of unfree and bound labor. All right, now I'm standing in front of a crowd of people that know a lot about George Washington. So you might be saying right now, we know George Washington loved to drink wine, but he failed to make wine at Mount Vernon. Correct. Even his French friends made fun of him for it. But failure is as illuminating as success. And it's not as if viticulture and vinification were momentary or fleeting interests for George Washington. In fact, George Washington gave money, time, and energy to his and other people's viticultural pursuits for nearly 4 decades. He tried again and again to grow grapes for winemaking, as well as to grow grapes for eating. I just want to say big thanks to Holly Gunter, who got me started on this timeline, which I've spent the last few months filling out. And if you have any other viticultural moments for George Washington, please let me know so I can add it to this timeline. Now, winemaking wasn't the only kind of agricultural experiment that George Washington undertook, nor can we really even consider it like in the top 5 most important that he undertook. But when we put his efforts in a broader context, when we begin to connect them to others' viticultural dreams and pursuits, we can begin to uncover how the roots of wine, slavery, and the American South found themselves entwined. In researching George Washington and viticulture, 2 things really stand out to me that connected him to a broader winemaking network and to a much longer winemaking history. First is his investment in various winemaking ventures in 18th century Virginia. And the second, his experimentation in growing grapes, both European and native, on a plantation where both enslaved and free would have contributed labor. Now, these are important because to succeed, an American wine industry needed at least 3 things. 1, investment, needed capital and support from private citizens and from government. Second, labor, both specialized wine-specific labor, but also the more general physical labor of agriculture. And importantly, grapes. And they had to be grapes that weren't just gonna die and would actually make decent wine. The particularities of the South would end up shaping each of what I'm calling these ingredients in distinct ways. And George Washington very much wanted American wine to succeed. He was hopeful, convinced even, at various points in his life, that it was not only possible to make wine in America, and more specifically in Virginia, but that men like him would one day be able to make money from it. George Washington was not the only Southerner, not the only Virginian, not even the only Virginian founding father who was interested in producing and hopefully profiting from wine. You likely know Thomas Jefferson tried to make wine. Tried being the key word here because he likely also never produced a drop of wine at Monticello, but he was even more optimistic, even passionate about making an American wine industry a reality. Now, by the time Thomas Jefferson wrote those words, Virginians had been trying, sometimes successfully, though mostly not, to make wine and make it profitable for 2 centuries. From the earliest days of colonization, along with silk and olive oil, wine was consistently discussed by the English as one of the most desirable products that this so-called New World might be able to offer them. And the constant refrain was that there was no better place than Virginia for making wine. There were frequent invocations of just how similar Virginia was to the wine regions of France. European travelers to North America had long commented on the abundance of wild grapes that dotted the landscape. This included the profusion of sprawling vines in the woods of Virginia. This was very exciting to the English. Think about the culture and the climate of England, right? The cold and the rain meant that grapes are not going to thrive there. And they did not have a tradition of winemaking like they did cider and beer making. So for those that wanted to drink the nectar of the gods, they had to purchase it from their European rivals, especially the French and the Spanish. So King James got interested, the Virginia Company was interested, there's at least a minimal level of investment here. They now needed specialized labor to transform these wild grapes into something that could make wine-ish. What they didn't realize at this time was that these wild native grapes were quite different than the winemaking grapes of Europe. They're different in taste, texture, acidity, tannin. They are literally a different species and thus create a very different tasting fermented beverage than the beloved claret and Madeira of the Brits. For centuries, Americans would try to grow and make wine from both native and European grape species, with neither ever quite giving them what they wanted. But not knowing that European grapevines would succumb easily to American weather and pests, in 1619, the English began importing both European vines and European labor, a specific kind of laborer skilled in and steeped in the traditions of viticulture and vinification. In other words, this was not going to be an Englishman. It needed to be someone from France, Italy, Spain, Greece, Germany, one of the wine-producing countries. And by the way, there were vignerons who come from all of these different countries into North America, into what would become the United States into the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, this year, 1619, is said to be the earliest recorded effort to transplant the European vine to Eastern America. That year, 1619, is notable for another reason. Anybody know why? Also that. Yes, the first year we find enslaved Africans arriving in Virginia. Now, perhaps it's just a coincidence that the first vigneron and the first enslaved Africans arrived the same year to Virginia. But they did arrive for the same reason. They were bound to labor for Virginia, to make money for others. Now, wine did not become the great commodity that the Virginia Company was hoping for. Over the next several decades, Virginians planted small vineyards across the colony. Some wine was made, but the wine didn't become the, quote, staple that would allow the wealth to flow upon this nation, like Edward Williams prophesied in 1650. And that's because, along with problems in actually growing the grapes and finding the right kinds of labor, there was another crop that became so profitable, so desirable, that all other Virginia commodities took a back seat. Anybody want to take a guess what that was? Yes, indeed. Now, interestingly, the success of tobacco is going to lead, in part, to a revitalization in the desire to create an American wine industry by the mid-18th century. For by this time, a contingent of Virginia planters were worried, anxious, scared about the future of Virginia. They argued that the monocrop culture, their over-reliance on a single commodity, was hurting their pocketbooks, the empire, the very ground in which they planted. It is, of course, true that this weed had transformed Virginia economics, politics, and society, making the fortunes of many of the elite Virginia families, but it had also depleted the soil of nutrients, leaving the crop ground unable to support tobacco production for much longer. One solution, find new land, right? Washington, Jefferson, and others speculated on lands to the west, in part for this reason, but they also sought other solutions to find crops that were less environmentally destructive. In addition, tobacco overproduction had driven down the crop's value. This would lead to more calls for economic diversification. Now, wheat became a major alternative. We all know this here at Mount Vernon, but it was never the only one. Although historians have yet to engage with this fact, for decades, potential alternatives existed like wine. And if you don't know, by the way, wine grapes actually thrive in rocky or clay-filled or difficult, even poor soil. If you look at the Rhone Valley, you can see this. So this was a major bonus, right? The soil is depleted, but here is a crop we can grow. So in the second half of the 18th century, we see several attempts in the South to gather and utilize our ingredients for making an American wine industry: investment, labor, grapes. And Virginians led the way, individuals alongside their governments. In 1760, the General Assembly offered 500 pounds be given as a premium to the person who should, in any 1 year from that date, make the best wine. Now, who's paying for this? Well, a list you can see starting at the bottom of the first page and onto the second there, more than 100 men of means from some of the most prominent and elite families in Virginia, including George Washington. This was a kind of like early public-private partnership to encourage winemaking in the state. And in this viticultural scheme, quality and quantity mattered, right? They wanted it to be the, quote, best wine. But quantity was maybe even more important for their purposes. They wanted at least 10 hogshead of wine. That's roughly 3,500 bottles of wine. And this amount suggests that these subscribers were willing to put up their own money to encourage not just the making of wine for individual home consumption, but to prove that a wine industry could in fact exist in the colony. This was part of that centuries-long quest to produce commodities internally rather than importing them from adversaries like France and Spain. And by the way, this quest for domestic manufacture of goods is going to continue after independence. And it was hoped that establishing a flourishing wine industry would satiate the thirst of Americans and keep our own dollars in our own country. This actually became a rallying cry for winemakers and wine advocates in the 19th century United States. But this particular public-private partnership was also about encouraging that economic diversification. Notice that the delegates call out planters for continuing, quote, in the beaten track. They're referring to planters' continued cultivation of tobacco, even as its environmental destruction became clearer and its economic benefits less so. It was only until a planter could be, quote, roused by some great and certain profit that he would change. And the delegates were adamant that they could show wine could be just such a profit-making venture. Now, I found no evidence that they ever gave the first or second prize money to any winemaker. It was, another utter failure. But the quest wasn't over, and that is a constant theme. Try and try again. For the government invested in another winemaking venture just a few years later, when Virginia used public funds to establish a public vineyard in Williamsburg. The goal with this public vineyard, which was officially approved by the Virginia General Assembly in 1769, was again to show that Virginia wine was a solid alternative to tobacco, that such an industry was possible and profitable, as the act says, it is, quote, very probable that the most delicious wines might be made here and bring great riches to the people. They chose a Frenchman named Andrew Estave to lead this endeavor. Again, part of this long tradition of European immigrant labor in American wine. They looked to the knowledge of a Frenchman who we don't actually know much about, but seems to have made his case that he could make wine because of his nationality. With public funds, the trustees bought land for Estave near Williamsburg, as well as purchased, quote, 3 Negro men slaves to be worked on the said land under the direction and management of the said Andrew Estave for the sole purpose of cultivating vines and making wine therefrom. The enslaved men would provide the agricultural labor required in the vineyard, and considering the difficult, often quite physical labor required in cellars, they likely were to be engaged in work at multiple levels of the winemaking process. Now, something about the work, something about the vineyard, something about Estave, who we have evidence brutally beat at least one enslaved laborer, led several of the men coerced to labor at the vineyard to run away. Quamini, Cuffy, Jack, and there might be 2 different Jacks here, and Sunday. Both Jack and Sunday, also called Sondi, ran away at least twice during the few years that Estave owned them. These are small pieces of evidence, but they are so important. They confirm something that historians haven't recognized, that enslaved people were specifically purchased and put to work for viticultural purposes. This changes how we think about that who in American wine history. It also changes how we think about the failure of the wine industry in the 17th and 18th centuries, because there's a lot of talk about why these wine ventures fail. Is it weather? Is it pests? Is it lack of attention or skill? But self-liberation is not one of the issues that we've actually considered yet. So if Southern wine was going to succeed, it was assumed that, like all other Southern commodities, it would be produced with some level of enslaved labor. And we see this with yet another Virginia viticultural venture, that of Philip Matze, who had immigrated from Italy in the early 1770s, settled on a piece of land adjacent to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and almost immediately devised a plan for proving that American wine could be made. In 1777, he had sought out enough subscribers for an agricultural company dedicated to making wine and showing it was possible at a commercial scale. Even with these other wine schemes taking place, Virginians were interested. 37 men made up a subscription of 2,000 pounds sterling. Each share was 50 pounds sterling. Now, once again, we have a veritable who's who of 18th century Virginians and enslavers, including George Washington. And the timing here is important, 1774. Not only do we have the continued desire for economic and agricultural diversification that we saw with earlier wine schemes, we also have the context of the non-importation craze of the 1770s, which encouraged Americans to forego imports of items like wine. Multiple Virginia wine ventures in just a few years begins to make more sense in these contexts. Now, like the public vineyard in Williamsburg, the assumption was that Philip Matze's company would use slave labor as a part of this viticultural venture. I haven't been able to find Matze purchasing enslaved people explicitly for use in the vineyard or cellar, but I do know that he was renting enslaved laborers from friends, including Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Adams. Now, you might also notice that the laborers Matze was to use company money on were not just enslaved, but were also, quote, servants. This is likely a reference to the 7 Italian immigrants Matze brought with him as indentured servants, men who would later on claim to have been treated like, quote, slaves. And this is something that actually the French vignerons had claimed 150 years before. So we see here varying degrees of freedom and unfreedom for these bound laborers in Virginia's vineyards, not only on Matsay's, but also on the Williamsburg public vineyard, as the trustees there had not only purchased enslaved workers, but also apprenticed, quote, 3 poor boys to be taught the art of cultivating vines and making wine. Now they too were to be bound to Estave in this work. And yet we must remember that these young boys, like the Italian immigrants on Matsay's vineyard, lived in a world that made race a pretty big distinguishing factor in what your life actually looked like while bound. While the slaves were to be, quote, under the direction and management of Andrew Estave, the bound apprentices were to learn an art and an industry. They would go on to become the overseers and the vintners, those who could one day themselves have slaves under their own direction and management. Now, the Williamsburg Public Vineyard, Matsay's Company, and other 18th century endeavors were meant to demonstrate the possibility and profitability of making wine using bound labor. Based on most metrics, they failed. Matsay's vineyard produced grapes and potentially some wine, but by the late 1770s, most of his vines had been destroyed. And by 1777, Virginia had given up on Estave and the public vineyard. They posted an ad in the Virginia Gazette for the sale of the project's land and the enslaved people. As of now, I haven't figured out what happens to the enslaved laborers from the vineyard, but the land is eventually gifted to the College of William and Mary, which then sells it in 1791. But why did these ventures fail, like so many before them? We've got to go back to our 3 ingredients. Investment and support waned, labor was unreliable, and of course, there's those pesky little grapes. Remember back to 1619, when Virginians were hopeful that both cultivated native grapes and imported European grapes would thrive here? 150 years later, and neither had proven itself able to grow or make decent wine. Debates raged in the 18th century press about whether native or European grapes were the right choice for the climate and soil of Virginia. Andrew Estave engaged in just such a debate with Robert Bowling Jr. in the 1770s, and the Frenchman was convinced that native grapes were the right choice, that they were far less susceptible to pests, rot, mildew, and overripening. And he was right. They are all of that. But they just don't make wine that tastes like what people assume wine should taste like. Wine from native grapes was considered far inferior to that which was produced by European grapes. But Vitis vinifera, which is the European grape species, simply could not grow adequately anywhere on the North American continent, really outside of California, at least not until the advent of pesticides and the discovery of grafting European vines onto native rootstock, which would happen in the late 19th century. So if native grapes wouldn't work and European grapes wouldn't work, what grapes would work to make an American wine industry a reality in the 19th century? Any ideas? Hybrids. And I'm talking not about Priuses, I'm talking about hybrid grapes. The most successful hybrids, the 2 that are said to have finally created an American wine industry, just so happen to have been discovered by enslavers on their southern farms. These 2 grapes are the Catawba and the Norton. So first, the Catawba grape. As a hybrid, it is part Vitis vinifera and part Vitis labrusca. The labrusca species, a native grape, is well known for what some people call a foxy or musky character. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's like the infamous quote, you know it when you drink it. But as a hybrid, it was much hardier and able to withstand a range of climatic issues, from heat and humidity to unexpected spring frosts. You know about all that here in Virginia. Catawba would become a national phenomenon in the 1820s and 30s when Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati began to make a dry sparkling wine. The bubbles apparently helped to mask that muskiness. This is considered the first commercially successful American wine. You can see a drawing of it on the right there. But Catawba isn't from Ohio. Catawba River is, of course, in North Carolina. But the man who discovered the Catawba grape, who sent Longworth the cuttings of the Catawba, found it growing wild in Maryland. That man was the enslaver John Adlam, who then cultivated this wild grape on his Georgetown farm in the early 1820s. And there it flourished. He sent cuttings not only to Nicholas Longworth, but to Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and many other leading men. He made Catawba wine and then gave it for no cost to senators and public officials in DC, hoping that they would fall in love and talk about it and then buy some of it. There were two representatives who were so roused by the wine that they went looking for Adlam's vineyard in Georgetown. And they reported in this March 1824 newspaper article that there was a, quote, black vine dresser who, and I'm assuming him to be enslaved here, managed the vines, providing the viticultural work without which wine could not be made. Adlam believed that his Catawba was the future of grapes, of wine, of the South, of slavery. In fact, Adlam argued that his endeavors had finally proven that wine was not just any other commodity, but one that could rival cotton and sugar. Two crops, of course, made exclusively by slave labor at this point. Another hybrid discovered in the South soon joined Catawba in helping create an American wine industry, and this one actually had even more potential than the Catawba. The Norton, part vinifera, part native species Vitis estivalis. I say more potential because of the taste of the wine made from the grapes. It doesn't have Catawba's foxiness. Instead, it expresses itself much more like a vinifera. On Magnolia Farm, northwest of Richmond, Virginia, the enslaver Daniel Norton likely accidentally created this hybrid grape and then began to spread it across the South and even westward. And it would take root and help establish what became a thriving wine industry in Missouri by the time of the Civil War. Like Catawba, this native hybrid, cultivated on a Southern farm, became the literal ingredient for making an American wine industry a reality. But the vineyards and cellars of Missouri were, in at least one important way, different than those of Norton, Adlam, Matze, and Estave. For the Missouri wine industry was established by abolitionists. And for these vintners who hailed from Germany, winemaking was antithetical to slavery. The grandfather of Missouri wine, George Husman, succinctly put it, quote, "The grape can only flourish on free soil and by free, intelligent labor." Of course, Southern winemakers disagreed. Some even went so far as to argue that slavery was an essential part of a vibrant and profitable wine industry. One South Carolinian put it in 1859, quote, "With all the facilities we possess at the South, with our soil, climate, and more particularly our slaves, nothing can prevent ours from becoming the greatest wine country that was." On farms and plantations, in urban gardens and frontier settlements, Southerners dreamed and schemed about an American wine industry from the moment they stepped foot on the soil. Many of those Southerners were enslavers who directed their laborers, who were enslaved, apprenticed, indentured, or hired, to plant grapes and make wine. They invested money, wrote letters, published articles and books, experimented with grapes, even got their own hands dirty to make it a reality. And the men who did so were not marginal thinkers. From some of our earliest presidents of the United States to the Vice President of the Confederate States of America. This, by the way, is my in progress list of enslavers who experimented with engaged in, invested in, or championed winemaking. Enslavers' viticultural attempts and advocacy spans geography and chronology, across the South and across early America into the chaos and destruction of the Civil War, when pro-slavery firebrand James Henry Hammond was proclaiming his faith in the millions he would make with wine as the next great slave-made cash crop. Now, I've still got plenty of work to do to transform these ideas into a book, but all that I've gained as a fellow here from the conversations, tours, book recommendations, advice, research rabbit holes, and even having to come up with something vaguely coherent for a brown bag, has gotten that transformation started in a way that nothing else could. So thank you again to the library, to my fellow fellows, to all the folks at Mount Vernon, to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, to George Washington for at least trying to make wine, and to all y'all for showing up today. Now, thoughts, questions, wine recommendations? Yeah. They were over there. Yes, please. There's a mic right there for you.
Was Nicholas Longsworth, the Nicholas Longsworth of Cincinnati, the Roosevelt connection and the Longsworth building for the House of Representatives? I mean, was he the ancestor of that lot?
I'm fairly sure he is the father of that Nicholas Longworth, yes. Nicholas Longworth was a multi-millionaire. He invested heavily in real estate in the Cincinnati area, and then in the 1820s started this viticultural venture and became, continued to be wealthy from it. And there are papers at the Library of Congress of, I'm pretty sure either his son or his grandson, that has that long history and connection.
And salacious history too.
Oh, love it. Let's talk more about that.
We have a question over here. With regards to George Washington's experimentation here in Hammond, do you have any specifics about where that took place? Was it here at National Farm or any specific?
Yes, so there was a, excuse me, the vineyard enclosure, which you probably know now as the nursery. By the 1786 or so, it had transitioned fully away from vineyard and into that nursery and fruit garden. But before 1786, we're fairly certain that that is where the experimentation is taking place. The table grapes might have been in other areas where food crops were being grown or experimented with. But right now, all that I have found in terms of wine grapes has been focused on that vineyard enclosure. But there are references later to at least cuttings being sent, and I believe grapes being planted, not just for table, but for wine. And that I have no idea where that's happening. Maybe it's happening again where the nursery is. Maybe it's happening elsewhere. But there's not a specific, in those later years, there's no specific place that we know that it would have been taken. Thanks. Ah! What a dream. Yeah. There might be wild vines, but... Thanks.
In your research, have you found any links to the use of slaves?
I have done less work focusing on that. I do know that later there are other kinds of bound labor that are used, including actually Nicholas Longworth's vineyards and wineries. He has tenant farmers who are treated very poorly, usually German tenant farmers. And then in California, around Los Angeles, which used to be called the City of Vines, that's really where the center of winemaking was before it transferred northward to Napa after the Civil War. But around Los Angeles, there was indentured indigenous labor that was utilized on the vineyards and in the wineries. And so I know in other areas, not just in the kind of traditional South that I would think about it today, there was European bound in varying degrees labor being used. One interesting thing is that there's a kind of move by historians in the past decade or so to reconsider how we think about California as a free state, because we actually know that slavery was taking place in California. And so not just indigenous indentured labor, but actually enslaved Black labor as well. So when I'm thinking about how I'm defining the South, I'm thinking actually expansively about how I might be able to bring California into this conversation as well. But it's an interesting, question about what's actually happening in Europe. I just personally haven't done research on it. Thank you, though.
So they've been thinking about wine between North America for a really long time, right?
Mhm.
You look at the late 1500s that they're writing about in North America, and it's always listed, like you said, with oil
Mhm.
and silk. So are some of your wine walks trying silk? Is that similar sort of, let's try.
Oh, yes.
Disaster.
Oh, yes.
So are some of your same people just trying these strains again and again and again?
Absolutely. We see that in Virginia. We see that in South Carolina. We see it in Georgia. And it's happening pretty frequently. It seems that they give up more easily with silk than they do with wine. Questions about, why that happens. I mean, in some ways, wine is really easy to make. It just, you might not get the exact end result that you want. Silk isn't that. Silk is really difficult to produce, and it requires, just a very different kind of skill set. Both of them are useful for enslavers because they're seen as, additional, except for, I don't know what Hammond's a different thing, but they're really seen as like additional crops that don't require the same kind of labor at the same time that their primary crops do. And so it can be this additional source of income, profitable, hopefully. But I don't know as much about silk, but I think that that is kind of a similar idea here, is that we have these additional like luxuries being made that we can then use and sell along with our tobacco or wheat or cotton or whatever it may be. But those three things together are so often seen as potential alternatives to another kind of crop.
Hi, Whitney.
Hey.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the iconography of grapes and
Yeah.
wine. I was thinking a lot about how much the founders and others were sort of considering ancient Greece and ancient Rome and wine and grapes, and how they're all over in terms of decor, our capital, and just feature so heavily in how they were thinking about what a republic was. Obviously, we know that there was hypocrisy and irony in the idea of a republic. And I was wondering if that has featured in your work at all, thinking about the visual components and the symbols that wine and grapes are.
Yeah, it's been in the back of my mind, but I haven't pursued it in terms of research or analysis yet. But I want to be thinking of, there are kind of two parts of wine that I have not done enough thinking about. One is its connection to histories that early Americans loved, Rome and Greece. And the second are the religious connotations. So as I move forward in the project, I'm not sure that they're going to be at the forefront, but I do think that they're important context to understand why grapes and wine are so prevalent in the culture. Not necessarily compelling people to want to make it, but certainly a part of the kind of broader American society and culture at the time. If you have any ideas or any readings, please let me know. Thanks.
Right? I was wondering if there are any plantation widows who actively participate in viticulture.
Great question. None that I have found so far, but there is a gendered dimension to winemaking that develops in the 18th century. Winemaking for domestic consumption was very much part of women's work for a long time, and we see it in cookbooks. So not just grape wine, but currant wine was a really big thing, and we see women as as the people who are actually either overseeing or doing that labor themselves. And I also see even into the 19th century agricultural fairs that are giving prizes for different types of commodities. And the grape wine is almost always often given to a man, but other types of wine like this currant wine or raspberry wine would be given to a woman. And one wine is considered superior to the other. So there is a gendered dimension to wine, but I haven't yet found a specific woman who kind of takes over this work or is overseeing it. I'm going to say yet. I always want to say yet because, listen, I'm not sure. It might be out there. I hope it is. If anyone is listening and you know, please let me know. Thank you for that question, though.
I was struck by Robert Pleasance in the list of Matsai subscribers who said that he would withdraw his share if any slaves were purchased to support the project. Do you have any speculation that that might be why Matsai is not buying? Is because this appears sort of a rising sentiment of at least discomfort with slave holding as one to hire? Is it awkward to buy? Is it becoming pretty awkward to buy at this time?
That is an interesting question. I haven't thought about it that way. I sometimes wonder if Matze was a bit of a con artist. Y'all probably know, you may know Matze from the Revolution. He goes to Tuscany to try to raise money for the revolution. He's sent by Virginia. He fails. He then has this very interesting life and he ends up coming back. He actually comes to Mount Vernon. He visits in the 1790s. But there is something about several of these men in the 1760s and 1770s, and it's not just with wine, but who are at the head of these kinds of agricultural experiments, seeking subscriptions. And I mean, the amount of money that Matze raises it's a lot of money. And he is never a wealthy man. I don't know where the money goes, and I know that he actually doesn't, I'm fairly certain he doesn't receive all of the money. But I don't know if it's necessarily because of some compunction that he has about enslavement, but rather because, one, I haven't found it, or two, he actually couldn't afford it, or three, it was easier just to hire out enslaved people from his neighbor, Thomas Jefferson, and one of his best friends, Thomas Adams. I think there are several other reasons that I think might be more convincing, but it's certainly something to consider from the context of the 1770s in Virginia. You have a follow-up?
This whole talk starting with Hammond has reminded me of Charlie Westry's book on this.
Oh, yeah.
Projecting, raising money that never actually shows up. It's all promises of money rather than actual money. And the same way that Western comes going on in the midst of the imperial crisis of the revolution, in the midst of the crisis of the Union and the Civil War, it seemed very. We go to these people's letters looking for them to talk about politics, and they talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the difference with Hammond is that he actually was making wine. The other folks, it's very unclear whether they produced a drop of wine or not, except for Charles Carter, who did in fact produce wine in the 1760s and received a prize from the Society for whatever in London. But Hammond is actually doing the thing, and he doesn't have outside investment. He's using all of his own at the time. But I need to reread that book, so thank you for that.
You made the comment that Norman made an accident. Great.
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
Yes. So from what I understand, there were, these vineyards were not planted in the way that modern vineyards are with single varietals. They were planted with multiple, not just varietals, but species altogether. And because native grapes are not, cultivated Vitis vinifera does not require a pollinator. Native grapes do. So that means that hybridization can happen much more easily. Vitis vinifera is, it's what do you call that? Not self-propagating, self-pollinating, thank you. Whereas native grapes are not. So from what I understand, he had multiple different, both native and then vinifera, and it just kind of happened that a new grape was formed, and he found it in his farm, in his garden, and he was like, well, look at this. And it just was by almost like coincidence that this happened, and then he saw that it did. This was not this was not a legitimate scientist being like, I shall make this hybrid right now. And he was just, oh, what a happy coincidence that this happened. That's at least how I understand it.
Because grafting didn't start until.
Well, grafting has been happening for a very long time, but understanding that grafting was necessary to keep Vitis vinifera from succumbing to a particular kind of louse called phylloxera, which in the mid to late 19th century nearly destroyed the European wine industry. I mean, it's something like 70%, 80% of French vines gone because of this North American louse that's made its way across the Atlantic Ocean. And it was actually a Texan, along with some others, who discovered that if you graft vinifera onto native North American rootstock, the louse goes for the roots. And so because it's native, it is resistant to this North American louse. So that's what ensured that we can now grow it here. And almost all of the vines in Europe have American rootstock. So just think about that.
Seems like we have time for one more question. Research after the Civil War, the first formerly enslaved person who might have been working with grapes or cultivating, or after that transition, what happened?
Oh, yes. So I have done a little bit of work in this. I mentioned her earlier, Sydney Love, who's a wine writer, who's also working on Black American winemaking. She has done some work on this. She has found at least one formerly enslaved person from Monticello who is growing grapes and making wine in Charlottesville after the war. And there's also a man named Sidney Weller. He's a white man, formerly enslaver in North Carolina, who started the most successful Carolina winery. And after the Civil War, he employs formerly enslaved people alongside white men to do the labor in his winery and on his vineyard. And we actually have sketches of white and black men working alongside one another at this particular vineyard. So we have at least a couple of examples, and I know there are more people who were doing work on this and really trying to show, as part of a larger kind of reclamation of American food and beverage, and showing the roots of it in African and Caribbean skills and knowledge. Wine is also a part of that work that's being done. And so as the more and more that we find about it, we're seeing that, Black labor, indigenous labor from the 17th through the 19th century was integral, just like immigrant labor today is integral to the wine industry in America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you.